You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your co-hosts here, as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back with you.
Eugene, it's great to be back on with you. How you doing?
You know, I'm doing well. You could say the pleasure's all mine. Mind, I don't know.
Ooh.
Mining for pleasure, I guess. That'll be maybe the goal of this show, perhaps, that it'll be a pleasure for everyone to have been here. But, I'm good. As pushing forward here, as always, as we continue in the midst of all of the good and bad things swirling around us in the world news, a lot of which we have to bring you here today on the show, which is a good time to remind you that, whoever you may know, this would be a good time to let them know that you're watching a fantastic show, The Freedom Side Live, and that there's a fantastic lineup of guests from really everything. Political prisoners in the United States, the civilian deaths in Donetsk, the World Cup, the possibility of the Supreme Court more or less ending democracy in America, elections in Cuba, the rail strike. We got all sorts of things happening here. So good time for whoever is following you to be following us. So let them know, smoke signal, carrier pigeon, whatever seems right. And you're already here on YouTube.
I just sent a carrier pigeon to all of my friends.
Nice.
I have several. Yeah. While you weren't looking, I was like, fly.
You don't need to say anything, actually. They're better trained than that. I think if you just say, it's almost like you're releasing them to escape from like a prison or something.
Well, you put them in a cage first, I assume. I'm not really sure how this works.
Believe me, I can explain it to you. I have done a lot of research into carrier pigeons.
Why?
I know how it works.
Why have you done research into carrier pigeons? I'm so
that's not relevant. What's important to know is that I understand how carrier pigeons operate. That's what's important.
All right. Okay.
It's honestly a lot more difficult than you think to procure a carrier pigeon.
I did text message people the link to the show. I did do that.
Well, I hope you also told them that when they're watching on YouTube that they should hit subscribe and the bell so that they can get the alerts to the things that they've just subscribed to. All the fantastic stuff coming out via our YouTube channel here on Breakthrough News, including the fantastic Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Great show.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just had a big episode too.
I did. I got to sit down in Beirut with the one and only Layla Khaled and talk about her life in the Palestinian struggle and other cool insight into her thoughts on regional resistance. So definitely check that out if you haven't. It's also a good time to remind people that you can support all of our excellent programming, which includes Eugene's Punch Outs, as well as my Dispatches, as well as this show, The Freedom Side, as well as so much more that we have going on at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Or if you'd rather or also like to make a one-time donation, you can actually donate below on YouTube. There's a donation option. You can also donate on our website as well. So lots of ways to support the show so we can keep growing, keep bringing you a lot of really amazing content. We're about to come up on another year.
Yes.
So lots of exciting stuff happening. So yeah, be sure to support Breakthrough News.
Yes, before you end the year. We're coming up on the end of the year. Great time to make a donation and to help us start the new year off right. And a lot of exciting things that are going to be coming. So subscribe, hit the bell, donate, all those different things, and let people know that we are here and that we are live. And, as always, of course, Rania, there's a lot of things going on everywhere around the world, sort of on two opposite sides of the world. Issues we've talked a lot about here on Breakthrough News are advancing in different ways, and that means two totally different issues, but I think interesting to note that. Moore v. Harper, which is a court case in front of the Supreme Court, really around democracy and the right to vote in the United States, and Sudan, two issues we've talked about a lot here on Breakthrough News, both having big weeks. The good news I'll start with, Rania, is the Moore v. Harper case in front of the Supreme Court, which had oral arguments yesterday. For people who don't know, haven't been following it, well, definitely check out everything we've done on Breakthrough News. But long story short, Moore v. Harper is basically going to determine whether or not state legislatures have total control over how federal elections are run. Now, that's relevant because you may remember from 2020, there were all these issues about will states be able to have their own electors that go against the popular vote of the state and essentially sort of overturn the one person, one vote and go to a sort of state legislature elects the president or at least potentially reality. So, who knows exactly what would happen, but there's huge implications in the case. So it was in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, and here's the good news, and this is why I said it's good news. It seems that even though it is a right-wing Supreme Court, certainly a Supreme Court that doesn't seem to favor the rights of people, most of the Supreme Court, with the real exceptions of Alito and Thomas and to some degree Kavanaugh, seem to not be that convinced by the lawyers for the state of North Carolina, which is trying to do this to make it easy for state legislatures to control elections. So we don't know what's going to happen, but it does seem, at the very least in oral arguments, that the Supreme Court is not ready to overturn the fact that the person with the most votes should win the election. Well, it doesn't really happen that way. That the person with the most votes should win the election in each individual state, and that the electors of those states should then be reflected in the Electoral College. So it's obviously not a huge change in our anti-democratic electoral system, but it is perhaps a sign it won't become more anti-democratic, Rania.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we'll have to wait and see, but it is really striking also. I feel, I mean, I've seen this issue, this case get a lot of attention, sort of get some attention in the mainstream media in written form. I just haven't seen that much on other platforms, which I'm surprised by just because of the implications. Like you could literally have one state in the country overturn a presidential election. Not to even, not even talking about the state issue of like being able to turn elections in states. And also there's already so many anti-democratic maneuvers that have come into play over the last 25, 30 years, especially over the last 15 to 20, with Republican state legislators putting in various, I remember even in Virginia, the last election on the local level, there was an attempt that, like the redistricting, for example, like Republicans are really good at already doing all of these things to make our system unbelievably anti-democratic. And this would just be like another sort of nail in the coffin of what little democracy exists in the U.S.
Well, it's funny that you say that, Ronnie, and I wanted to note that exact point about this history of the U.S. and how anti-democratic it was. So the nature of this case, Moore v. Harper, comes from a gerrymandering issue in North Carolina, right? And gerrymandering is just when you draw the lines in order to favor, basically one political party over another, illegally, essentially. So gerrymandering is named after one of the founding fathers, a guy named Elbridge Gerry. That's Jerry with a G. And I'm saying all this, Rania, just to say that one of his notable quotes is that democracy was the worst of all political evils. And he was actually considered to be one of the more democratic people at the Constitutional Convention. So democracy, the worst of all political evils. That's Elbridge Gerry, founding father, the progenitor, I guess, if you will, of gerrymandering as a term, which has led us to this point where the Supreme Court is considering a case that could indeed mean that what he says is the worst of all political evils would not really be the case in any functional shape or form.
Unbelievable. That's incredible. I had no idea. That should be like a headline right there. But it's not even being framed that way. I mean, just reading about this case, it's being made to sound very, like, a lot more complex than it actually is. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just straight up anti-democratic. And it is good that it's not necessarily like in stone and inevitable that this is going to go the wrong way. But it's still unbelievably concerning because the thing about these kinds of cases is that there's like this constant attack, right? There's this constant attack. I mean, these cases take a while to make their way to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. They're being funded by someone, sometimes dark money groups. I'm not sure exactly what the case is with this one. Maybe but my point is that it won't be the last kind of case, maybe not exactly like this, but of its kind, to try to make the country more anti-democratic, because there is an actual, like, never-ending attempt by certain forces in the country, dark money sort of right-wing forces, to try to take away the ability of, like, people to have any say in how our system is run.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's in some ways stunning. if you think about it. I mean, the rhetoric, and I mean, we talk a lot about this on the show. I mean, like the issue of how America goes abroad and use all of this democratic rhetoric, but then the system that they're telling people, is like the thing and what they should be following. When you really drill down on it, not only do you see it has all these problems, but that even those are being chipped away. And I think, we've seen that so significantly, especially in the wake of Citizens United, which was another one of these cases exactly like you said. It's like these people with all this money, they call them test cases, right? And they set it up specifically to get to the Supreme Court in order to be able to challenge, rules that, well, in the case of Citizens United, prevented billionaires from just flooding money with elections with as much money as they want. And here we are on this one. You've got Amazon, interestingly enough, who is taking the NLRB to court over the National Labor Relations Board, over all these issues of the just rank law breaking that Amazon was doing against union drives there. But a lot of people are thinking that the reason they're pushing so hard is they're actually hoping to appeal some of these cases up to the Supreme Court to gut the right of workers to union representation. So you can really see how the courts are being so manipulated right now. And then you think about all these right-wing judges that have gotten in and all these other things that have happened to make this more possible, a lot of which Democrats didn't really stand up to. And, it's a dangerous situation. It is.
I mean, look, that's how the abortion issue came to the Supreme Court. I mean, there wasn't the only case of its kind. It's how the issue of, and for like years and years and years, there's been the test cases to try to get affirmative action to be overturned at the Supreme Court. So yeah, I mean, it's really concerning. And of course, all that dark money actually does make it difficult to know who exactly is funding what at this point. I mean, Citizens United is one reason why it's more difficult to follow that sort of dark money at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's incredibly alarming, and it really is like just the most regressive forces imaginable, the most regressive anti-democratic forces imaginable trying to take us backwards. And we talked about this when we talked about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, of Roe. Like that was a part of that, and it wasn't the end. That was like just the beginning. So there's a big fight ahead. So even if this case doesn't go the worst way imaginable, it's not the end.
No, that's true. That's true. But speaking of repressive anti-democratic forces, great segue there. Sudan today, a lot of protests being repressed by the military and the police in the capital of Khartoum and the very nearby city of Omdurman in the wake of the signing of, as some people may have seen, a framework agreement. It's all very complicated the way they explain these things. But basically, if you want to understand it, there is a clique of people in the military who basically control the economy, who led a coup 2 years ago, took over the government in Sudan, and millions of people have been protesting against them, saying not only do they want democracy, but they want changes to the things that the Sudanese generals put in place, like selling the country to the IMF, normalizing relations with Israel, selling off the land left and right to any, buyer they could find in the Gulf states, heavily exploiting, Russia, Canada, other countries, the gold in the western part of the country. And so basically people are demanding a fair redistribution of the wealth, free healthcare, free education, political democracy, and an end to all these IMF type sellouts. And they've signed this deal to prevent that, basically, to try to split the opposition, to bring some elements of the opposition to the military into some, kind of condominium government that's supposed to be more fair, but it's really just the status quo. We interviewed one of the leaders of the Communist Party of Sudan a few months ago here, and he called it, and they call it, the soft landing, something that looks good on its face so that the U.S. and Europe, who claim they love democracy, can say, oh, look, we're supporting democracy in Sudan. But at the end of the day, short circuits everything right before all the critical questions. It gives people back some sense of representation, but no real actual control over society. So it's getting a huge, huge support from the U.S., the UN. The U.S. is threatening to sanction anybody who stands in the way of a democratic transition in Sudan. Blinken trying to sound real tough like they love the people of Sudan. But at the end of the day, this is really just to preserve things like normalization with Israel, IMF World Bank deals, total sell-offs of the resources of the country. Difficult situation, but nonetheless, people are taking to the streets in a big way, and I think will continue to over the coming weeks. So we'll see. It's not actually finalized. That's supposed to happen later in the month, so it may fall apart before then, but it's certainly the biggest news we've had in a while vis-a-vis Sudan, and I think it's being falsely portrayed in a lot of the media as if somehow like the protesters have won.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, you mentioned people in the streets, so I take it that those who have been in the streets for all this time, because it hasn't really relented, uh, they are opposed to this.
Yes, they're definitely opposed to this. And, they had really been laying something out called the three no's, the people who had been in the streets, which was basically boiled down to no negotiations with the military and no role for them in any future government, and that they needed to just move out of the way and allow people to determine for themselves how the country would be shaped. So they've been trying to like sort of chip away and buy people off. And there are some elements and some political parties who have had some level of participation in the protest who are supporting this, but the core of it, the resistance committees, who have really been raising the most progressive demands alongside the unions and the Communist Party, are 100% against. And a lot of them are actually predicting it's going to fail because already, even between the signing and today, some of the people who signed it are already raising concerns that it's not going to, be what they want. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if it can really hold, especially because, especially in Khartoum, the protests will be unrelenting, I think.
And how does this fit into like the broader context of the region, or does it?
It does. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's the role Sudan has been playing regionally has been interesting. I mean, they had been, for instance, sort of soft supporting the TPLF in Ethiopia and the war there, but now they're actually going way out of their way to try to make nice with Ethiopia and Eritrea and sort of mend all fences. And they've also been kind of playing this weird middle ground role revolving the issue between Ethiopia and Egypt. So, I mean, it's a big question, I think, for the region. In that sense, that whatever new government came in, what attitude would they take towards some of these conversations about sort of broader unity in the region and the Horn of Africa? And I think it has huge implications for the Arab world in many ways, quote unquote, which Sudan is also a part of, because Sudan is basically the backbone of the Saudi military effort in Yemen. Sudan historically was one of the biggest supporters of the Palestinian struggle, and all of that has that they've thrown Palestine under the bus under the generals. They backed the Saudis. So if you have this new government, these people who are on the streets are saying they want to pull the troops out of Yemen. They want to restore the relations with the Palestinians. So it could be a big change in the effort of the United States to really try to isolate the Palestinian struggle, to isolate the Yemeni people with their own, sort of anti-Iran security architecture piece. So it could have huge implications to the desire of the U.S. to really, deepen the hegemony of really Israel as the anchor of this sort of pro-U.S. bloc in the Arab world. So a lot of implications, I think, in East Africa, the Middle East, West Asia. And what happens is it flies under the radar because people don't pay attention to Africa. But I do think that there's a reason why you see the U.S., the UN, Europe, the Gulf states putting a lot of work into this diplomatically to get the right outcome, because they can see could be big implications.
I mean, I think it's also, when you mentioned the issue of Israel, it's so important to emphasize that Sudan's position against Israel goes so far back. So that in itself, the normalization is actually a very big deal. I mean, you mentioned the young generation has these three no's, and part of that is because, if I'm not mistaken, Sudan is like famous for the 1967 three no's, right? Where you had this adoption of no to peace with Israel, no to recognition of Israel, and no to negotiations with Israel. So in that sense, I mean, that alone is like huge to have this normalization effort. And for the US to be like making that a condition, also just shows how important it was to get this country that historically has been so in solidarity with Palestine, and so against the state of Israel, to turn that around. It's actually kind of stunning.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really was just straight up blood money. And yeah, the people in Sudan, they're not feeling that. Palestine got a lot of support there. Same way we always see Israel bombing Syria. That used to be how it was with Sudan. They were always bombing Sudan because they were claiming they were shipping weapons. I don't know if that's true or not, but they were. Well, it's going to be interesting to see. So I think all eyes on Sudan, I'd say at this point. It's going to be an interesting one. Supreme Court as well, also going to be interesting to see. But this is another reason why you should hit subscribe on YouTube and also hit the bell to get the alerts, because we will continue to cover all of this on all sides of the globe, if you will, all of these important stories. And we want to have you here alongside us and giving us your support and your feedback as we move forward.
Also, Eugene,
yes.
we have to also beat the algorithm. So you have to like it. Go just like everything. Subscribe to Breakthrough News, hit the notification button, and even just like it, just mass like all of our content because it
Yes.
helps with it boosts us in the algorithm. And you know what? Comment if you have time. No pressure.
Well, and Rania reads the comments. So, like,
I do.
if you comment, she's going to know what you say,
Eugene
good or bad.
Eugene doesn't, and I do, so that nobody else has to, and I take them very much to heart. I do. I'm
Yeah,
a
don't leave me any
relentless
messages in the
comment
comments.
lurker. Yeah.
Not that I don't love the
All right.
comments. And
Lurk,
comments.
like, and love. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. That's Matt. We have a behind the scenes crew, you guys. It's not just me and Eugene here. We're just the faces.
That's true. There's a Wizard of Oz effect.
There's
to this,
a puppet master. There's several puppet masters.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
now it's time to get serious.
I know. You got to keep it a little light. You laugh, keep from crying kind of scenario. But we are coming up this weekend, unfortunately, coming up on yet another anniversary of the arrest of the voice of the voiceless, Mumia Abu-Jamal, one of the most famous political prisoners here in the United States, former Black Panther, former journalist, the jailhouse lawyer of great repute and fame, really just someone who is being very grossly mistreated. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about that. We are very happy to have his grandson, Jamal Jr., joining us here on the show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing very well. Thank you, and appreciate having you here. And
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And, as I mentioned, we're coming up in just about a day on the anniversary of your grandfather's arrest. And, for people my age, this was such a huge case, and I know all the details like the back of my hand, but maybe for some people, they haven't really heard who is Mumia Abu-Jamal and how did he end up being one of the longest serving political prisoners in the United States?
Well, I think this is a case of, well, actually, at this point, people who aren't getting into good trouble is really a way of suspending the revolution. And Mumia Abu-Jamal is a worldwide renowned journalist, activist. His commentaries, there's people who enjoy his commentaries all over the world, and his
Oh, did we lose the sound?
We may.
Oh, that was our. I think that was our fault.
Oh, we got you.
I think.
All right.
Okay. Sorry. Continue. We
Good stuff.
had a little glitch, as you were saying.
No. Well, people around the world really appreciate his critique of capitalism and, just really fighting for the people. So who's Mumia? Like Mumia can be a different thing to depending on who we're talking to. But to many people I've talked to around the world, Mumia is an inspiration to like everyone. And how he became the longest, how he became 41 years in prison, really comes down to how he really defied a generation of media, who really wanted to discredit and like obstruct Black liberation movements. Mumia Abu Jamal, even incarcerated, he still maintained his innocence and I guess his status as a revolutionary journalist and speaking out. So many people really believe that because he hasn't been quiet and because he supports so many people, he's still incarcerated to this day.
How is his health at this point? What's the treatment like for him? I mean, all these years behind bars, where there's been various campaigns around the issue of his health and how he's being treated behind bars.
Well, it's not good. Right now, the current campaign is giving him a cardiac diet, which the jails have really been pushing back and fighting us back on. And the reason why he needs a cardiac diet is because he just survived heart surgery. I believe last year he just survived heart surgery, and along with heart surgery, right, he's had a severe case of like eczema, and he's had he has a litany of health concerns, which really tells a story of our elders being imprisoned for so long, right? Like the prison is not really designed for our elders to really, survive their imprisonment because of so much, just so much behind the scenes, and the neglect, the elder abuse that our elders really, really experience.
There's so much that could be said here about the deep injustices that the legal system has laid out in terms of keeping him in prison all these years. But talk a little bit about, if you could, the some of that really, because I mean it's honestly astonishing. Maybe it shouldn't be astonishing or surprising, but it is shocking. The From the original trial on, how much has been done to railroad him.
Well, the original trial. So when 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 I talk about my grandfather's case, I really like to talk about what's current, right? Because for 40 years, if Mumia would have been free because of the legality of his case, he would have been free a long time ago, right? And when it comes to Mumia Abu-Jamal in the court systems, racism really remains like the elephant in the room that nobody talks about, right? Nobody talks about the original trial court judge, Albert Sabo, who is infamous for his overt racism and sexism, right? Him saying, "I'm going to help them fry the N word," and this was reported by a clerk, who a court clerk, Terry Moore Carter, uh, and a fellow common pleas court judge. This was reported by them, during the original trial. So, for if a judge says, "I'm going to help him fry the N word," we know that racism is definitely in the courtroom, right? We also had ADA Jack McMahon. He made a policy clearing around like 1986, right? Stating that getting a competent and fair and partial jury is ridiculous, and if you do put black people on the stand, make sure they're from the South, and make sure they're older, right? It's a lot of, like, you have to be oblivious to the overt racism to even believe that this man should still be incarcerated, right? In October, we had a judge, Lucretia Clemens. Um, she basically gave a 31-page report with an intent to dismiss, and the reasoning was that she was just basically saying that a lot of our stuff was, it just couldn't be proven, and a lot of our stuff, like, she was really hampering on the defense in the 90s. That she said that they didn't do their due diligence, which we know was a lie, right? And we're really just fighting to to bring this guy home. And when it comes to just him being railroaded by the justice system, him being denied appeals, right? We can talk about the not only Albert Sabo, but we can talk about the Ron Castile, like, being a person that really benefited in his original railroad court trial, being the person that denies his appeals, for years and years, and that just came about. But we can also talk about in 2012, I believe, when they didn't want to pursue the death penalty no longer. They put him on life in prison. Like, I've never seen anything like this. Like, Mumia Abu Jamal is a case, that we haven't really seen a state go through the lengths of keeping a man incarcerated.
And of course, this isn't just any person to you. This is a family member. This is your grandfather. What's this like for your family? I mean, to have for all these years such a crucial, important person in your family be held for political reasons like this.
Well, and I think I'm echoing many people whose families are incarcerated, especially in this whole pipeline of prisons era, mass incarceration. It really throws it really disrupts your family, right? Because remember, like, Mumia, He was a father, right? And like my dad, who bears, who bears my name, right? My dad, had to lose his dad at a very, very young age, right? All my life, my grandfather has been incarcerated. And I'm pretty sure many people out there feel the same way, where they feel like it's unfair, and when we're talking about people being incarcerated for so long, for like really a case of reasonable doubt, if not like just a straight up like, mistrial case. And we're just, it really hurts to see the state of Pennsylvania keeping my grandfather and behind bars for so long, right? And it hurts me, it hurts my children, it hurts my cousins, right? Many of my family, is really trying their best, to like live with the pain to have, Mumia behind bars, right? And I really can't explain in words the constant state of mild to deep depression that I experience because my grandfather's still in bars.
I really appreciate you being willing to share that, and I really can only imagine. And I think for so many people, as you said at the beginning, Mumia has been, such a beacon, such a symbol of hope, even from behind bars, about the, what can happen in this world and how things can change. I certainly would count myself as one of them when I first heard of his case in 1999. And I wonder now, for those who are watching, who are seeing this and wanting to learn more and perhaps even wanting to take action, where they can go, what they can do to help in the efforts to free Mumia Abu-Jamal.
There's many campaigns that are helping in the efforts of Mumia's freedom. Currently, we're running a campaign titled "Love Not PHEAR," so it's Love Not Fear. And the reason why this campaign came to light is because we understand the fear that the state fear that people have to live with in Pennsylvania, right? So we're asking people to come together in the love of Mumia, right, in the loves of incarcerated elders and political prisoners, and really challenge, right, and overcome the fear of state retaliation. So it's lovenotfear.com. We're actually doing a letter writing campaign. There's also murals being erected all over the nation. The letter writing campaign is actually going directly to Lucretia Clemens, right, and really challenging her beliefs when it comes to Mumia Abu-Jamal. Like, I believe that Lucretia Clemens really believes that, truth and reconciliation is to be had in Pennsylvania. But when we're talking about Mumia Abu-Jamal, for some reason, it seems like it's something that's political, more political than legal. So the letter writing campaign is really asking Lucretia to do the right thing, right, and really like demanding her to do the right thing based on what she really believes in.
Mm-hmm. Well, lovenotfear.com. People certainly could check it out if you're more interested. And Jamal Jr., I just want to thank you so much for being willing to come on and let us know about Mumia Abu-Jamal, his history, his case, and what people can do to help.
Copy. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Unbelievable situation, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's people really do have to look it up and look into it. I mean, almost every single thing they said was a lie. They strong-armed these witnesses. They bribed them or threatened them with arrest in order to lie about where he was. They lied about, the nature of his injuries and the position of the shot to make it seem like he could have killed someone. They lied about whether or not the evidence had been touched by the police, and they were able to bury that for decades. And they said, this is XYZ, his gun, this, that, and the third. And then there's all this evidence being mishandled. The police, touching things and not putting them in the right, bags and chain of custody. So the evidence was totally tainted. What we heard about the trial, what we've heard subsequently about every trial that's happened. I mean, it really, if you want to think, are there political prisoners in the United States? I mean, there are a lot of political prisoners historically, and we've talked about a lot on this show. But, for those who don't believe that the justice system can act politically in America, all you need to do is look into the particulars of Mumia Abu-Jamal's case. And I think one of the things I also want to just highlight, too, is how many of the people became famous and powerful off his case,
Yeah.
over the years. Ed Rendell, former governor of Pennsylvania, you might see him on CNN and all those places as a Democratic surrogate. He's one of them. Tom Ridge, also former governor of Pennsylvania and Homeland Security Secretary. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but a huge number of Pennsylvania political figures in the 80s made their bones off of framing Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was called the voice of the voiceless because his radio program, and he was the Journalist of the Year, by the way, by the National Association of Black Journalists. His radio program was so powerful in lifting up stories that people, didn't want others to hear, but really, unbelievable, really. I will say one thing, it is true worldwide, he's so popular. If you ever go to Paris, in the suburb of Saint-Denis, the road that leads into Nelson Mandela Stadium, which is a huge soccer stadium there, is Rue Mumia Abu-Jamal. They named the road after him in his honor, and that's one of many of the honors he's received around the world. Desmond Tutu is called for his freedom, among others. The late Desmond Tutu, really, really worth looking into.
Indeed, indeed. And not the only political prisoner. Like, we always think of the U.S. as a place where we don't have political prisoners. We have people in prison for committing crimes, even if they're crimes of poverty. No, we have actual political prisoners. Mumia Abu-Jamal isn't the only one.
No.
But he's probably the most well-known.
Definitely the most well-known. There's few. Thankfully, Mutulu Shakur just got out. David Gilbert is still in, and many, many others. It's the Jericho movement. Jericho is in the Holy Land, Jericho movement here in the United States, if people are more interested in checking that out. Well, now we're going to swing around to the other end of the world. Going to be talking about things happening in Donetsk and the Donbass and some of the things you probably never heard about. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Johnny Miller, who's a British journalist and a Press TV correspondent who is currently in Donetsk. Johnny, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, we really are happy to have you because I think here in the U.S., you get a lot of news about, what is the toll on civilians, among other things, in, the Ukrainian government-held territories in Kyiv and places like that. But you really don't hear anything about the daily lives of people who are living in, I guess what's now Russia, in Donetsk, in the Donbass, and you've been there. And talk a little bit, if you could, about the toll that this war is taking on civilians there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently the only Western journalist in Donetsk, i.e. Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. There's a Russian foreign government contact who tells me that not a single British or American journalist has even applied to come to Russian-controlled Ukraine. There have been French journalists here, there have been German, there have been Italians. So the Russian government are allowing Western journalists in, but there's been no French and no British or American journalists here, which means British and American journalists simply are not hearing the stories that are coming out from this side of the conflict. I'm in Donetsk right now in Donbass. Let me tell you what the last few days have been like. It's one of the most underreported stories in the world, and it's shocking. Of course, Ukraine now is perhaps the most important war that's happening in the world right now. One person was killed by Ukrainian shelling in Kiev, in a neighboring district, Kievsky district next to me today. Day before this, 8 people were killed. Day before that, 5 people were killed. 2 days before that, another 5 people were killed. This is by Ukrainian shelling. I'm leaving Donetsk tomorrow for Moscow, so normally I'm careful about what I say for security reasons, but my own neighborhood has been shelled many times. Missiles landed outside my block. I've lived in different buildings, apartments here, and I've been here for last 5 months on and off. 3 different apartments I've lived in have been hit. I was in a church the other day. I tweeted about that. 2 days later, the church was hit, the cathedral. The market next to me has been hit. Going to a youth center yesterday, a woman was killed. Her body was lying on the street just outside as I reported. I've been to markets, bodies lying in the streets, people waiting for their bus, still waiting for their buses, bodies lying in the street. And that's just what life is like here for people in Donetsk. Because the underreported story here in Donetsk is that Ukraine is intentionally targeting its own civilians, people it claims are its own civilians. And this has been going on intermittently since 2014. I'm not sure how much you know about the conflict, but in 2014, there was a Ukrainian nationalist takeover of power, largely supported by Western countries, particularly by the United States, which took power and started suppressing their pro-Russian population, who are largely in the south and the east of the country. Then you had effectively a civil war starting. And while Russia is now targeting energy infrastructure all around Ukraine, it's an incredibly underreported story that Ukraine is purposefully targeting its own civilians here. Sometimes it hits energy infrastructure or administration buildings, but it also creates terror attacks. And it's just incredible for myself as a journalist. I don't know much about your news network, I'm sorry, but I can see that you give fantastic space to independent journalists. And increasingly, and there's some fantastic independent journalists who've been here, but mainstream sources journalists don't come here. So they don't get to hear that Ukraine is intentionally targeting its own civilians because it sees them as separatists, it sees them as pro-Russians. And living under this shelling, I mean, I run back to my apartment tonight to do this interview because there's a bomb landed just outside my apartment, and it's a shrapnel that rips these people apart. Children are being killed, and I've been to children's funerals being killed in this shelling, and it's an incredibly underreported story because mainstream Western reporters simply are not here, so you just don't get to hear about it. And the reason this is such an underreported story, the reason that mainstream journalists don't come here is because they want the European population and the American population to think that there can be no peace here, that it's all Russia's fault, that Russia is evil, that there's only one way to finish this war, and that's to pump weapons into Ukraine. And there is a peace to be had here. There's a huge almost everyone here in Donetsk is pro-Russian. This is a civil war. It started as a civil war. Almost everyone here is pro-Russian. And the European governments and the American government doesn't want their populations to know that there is a peace to be had and borders redrawn. And that's why they're not sending their reporters here to tell the truth of what's happening in Donetsk with Ukraine shelling their own civilians.
Yeah, it's so striking to me that you say that no English-speaking reporters have attempted to even visit there. I mean, a lot of times in conflicts, you do get kind of having been to spend time in Syria, I know a lot of people on all sides end up sort of getting handled, if you will. Is that the way it is in Donetsk, or do you feel like you're able to kind of walk around and talk to people freely? And then if so, what is the general sentiment that you get? Obviously, you say people are pro-Russian, but their general sentiment about the escalation of this war.
Yeah, there's absolutely no handling. I mean, I live in an apartment here. Obviously there's some security concerns. If Ukraine does hit a military target, it's difficult to get there. I go frontline access. It's very hard to get frontline Russian army access as a British journalist for obvious reasons, but I do get access with Donbass militias. But that's common in any army. As a foreign journalist, you're not going to get access with the American army, for example. I'm free to report here. This kind of idea that people in Russian-controlled territories are hugely controlled, or that it just doesn't exist. The vast majority of people here are pro-Russian. I was here in 2014, and there were Western mainstream journalists there in 2014. They admitted as well that the majority of people here were pro-Russian. Now that's changed since I've come back 8 years later. Now it's vast majority pro-Russian because many of the pro-Ukrainians have left. They didn't want to live under separatist rule. They didn't want to be bombed by their own government in Ukraine. So now it's vast majority pro-Russian. And this is why mainstream outlets aren't sending journalists here, because if a lot of mainstream journalists are honest people, good, honest people. And if they were here where I am now, they would have to report the fact that the vast majority of people here support Russia and that Ukraine is bombing civilians. I mean, we live under it. I mean, the streets are almost empty now, and it's dangerous, very dangerous on the streets. They would have no choice but to report this. They would have no choice to go to the markets, the schools, the bus stations with bodies in the street. They would have no choice to report that, and that's why they simply don't send their reporters here. because news happens where reporters are, and it's easy just not to send them. Therefore, people don't get to hear about it. But yeah, so myself working here, it's freedom to report. It's a normal situation.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think some of the reporting that you've done, a lot of the reporting you've done that we have followed, one of the things that stood out to me that was a huge story here, you know, the young woman who was pregnant in the hospital, or alleged hospital, was bombed, and it was the front page of every news, and it was huge outrage in the West. You were actually able to find her and talk to her, and the story was not exactly the story as the way it was told, you know, in the New York Times and the other elements. I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so she was famous for a picture. She was pregnant at a hospital that was apparently bombed by Russia. It may well have been bombed. I don't know. It may have been an airstrike. Russia was assaulting the city. It may have been a Russian strike. I don't want to get into that. I don't know. There's a lot of civilians who were killed by Russian strikes in the assault on Mariupol. I did meet one woman whose daughter was killed in that assault, and she still supported Russia. Why? Because a huge amount of people in Mariupol still support Russia. Now, the vast majority of people in Mariupol do support Russia. But she was pictured pregnant, walking down the stairs by reporters, and that image was broadcast around the world of, look what Russia is doing. And I found her here in a neighboring city of Donbass. I met her at a coffee shop, and she is a Russian citizen. She is pro-Russian. She has no criticism of the Russian army. She only has criticism of the Ukrainian army for bombing Donbass for 8 years. And that's the story that's not being told. And she only has criticism of how she was represented. She says that her story wasn't told. She says there was no Russian airstrikes, but mainstream media showed her to be a victim of Russian strikes. But in actual fact, she is a Russian citizen. She is pro-Russian, essentially. And her image has been used all around the world to stir up hatred of Russia. And what I think the failing is of the mainstream press was to report what she said, which is what I tried to do. I published a whole video interview on my Telegram channel of that. She essentially supports Russia. She's critical of the Ukrainians, and that's what was missing in the mainstream media's representation of that. They just show a picture of a pregnant woman in a bombed-out hospital, and they don't report what she actually says. There's a famous story of what happened in Syria. I was actually in Syria at that time, of Omran in the back of an ambulance. A famous picture of a boy in the back of an ambulance. Remember, I was actually in Syria at that time when Syrian government forces took over that area. And I spoke to the father, and the father turned out to not be critical of the Syrian government. And so it's incredible how these images speak louder than words, as they say, that powerful images can be portrayed when actually not giving the context of the story, and are used for propaganda purposes to demonize a certain government and to make people hate, essentially, as well. Make people hate a certain government or to manipulate people's views.
Right. I'm curious also, have you ever been to, I guess, the Ukrainian controlled areas? Have you attempted to? Would you even feel safe, actually, given, some of the rhetoric about, for example, like Iran?
Well,
And then, of course,
I was in Kiev to start with. I went to Kiev to start with.
And then in February.
Ukraine in March, I think. So when the Russians had surrounded Kiev, Festivy asked me to go. I hadn't worked for them for years. They called me up to go, and I said, which side? And they said, well, I don't know, Kiev side. So I went there. I started reporting for a couple of days, and my live interviews went up. And I was, I try to be, I'm an honest journalist, an honest man. I'm critical of, both sides, but also criticize NATO as well and the Zelensky government. And I saw these interviews go up, and I knew that Ukraine is now, it's banned all opposition parties. It's banned all media except for the main government channel. Anybody seen as pro-Russian is arrested, tortured, or killed. And so I left. I realized, I mean, I've been deported from countries before. I was deported from Israel. I've been deported from Bahrain, gone through very scary experiences, locked in rooms and threatened with violence. So I know how these things can happen to journalists. And so I left and then went to this side. And now I'm on the Ukrainian so-called hit list, Vedets. I don't know if you know about that. So it's an online database of Ukrainian enemies of the state in which hundreds of children are on that list. So I did a story about a 13-year-old girl, Fina. You should get on the show. She's on the Ukrainian enemies of Ukraine list, and she's a 13-year-old girl. Her home address is published on this site, and whenever a journalist is killed on this site, they write "liquidated" over the photo. So it promotes violence towards anybody on this site, and there's children on this site. When people talk about the Nazis or the far right, the extremist elements of the Ukraine, you just have to look at this site, which puts the home addresses and photos and names of children and promotes violence against them. So I'm on that list now, so I can't return. I can't go back to Ukraine. I'd be arrested or killed, simple as that. And for journalists, I mean, increasingly journalists around the world, Julian Assange is in jail. So many journalists. Increasingly, and now we're looking at this oncoming World War III. I was at the front line last week, and I spoke to Russian soldiers who they felt that they were fighting in the opening stages of World War III. A world war between NATO, led by the United States, and China, Russia, Iran. And increasingly, journalists do face potential of serious recriminations. A friend of mine, German journalist, is facing 3 years imprisonment in Germany. She can't return home. In Germany because she's facing imprisonment simply reporting the truth in Donbass. Her mother, I'm friends with her mother. She's a wonderful 65-year-old woman. She's a spiritual healer. She's a wonderful, lovely woman. She had her bank account closed in Germany, and she's had to flee to Russia as well. There's increasing persecution of journalists, and increasingly we're feeling very, very much under threat.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we let you go, Johnny, where can people follow your work?
Well, yeah, I'm reporting for Press TV here, also Twitter. I don't know if you've put the Twitter handle up. I can't remember, on Telegram as well. And yeah, I listened to some of your show, and it seems like you do fantastic work, guys. So thank you so much.
Right on. No, thank you, absolutely, and we'll definitely get this out and tag you so people can follow you wherever you are, and stay safe, and we're looking forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks, guys.
Wow. Go ahead, Rania.
Oh, I was just going to say, wow. I mean, it's definitely an interesting perspective to hear that you really don't hear from anybody else. And it's quite striking that he mentioned no other English-speaking journalists have even attempted to visit this place. It's crazy. I mean, at the very least, in Syria, there was English-speaking journalists that at least visited government-held areas, even if they reported, still in a very skewed manner, they at least visited.
Yeah.
And in this case, for them not to even try is just outrageous.
Yeah, well, maybe they learned their lesson, from all those New York Times articles about the Syrian elections where they would be forced to write all the people that we're meeting seem to be supporting Assad. There's I remember one of them they were actually in Lebanon, I think, reporting from just across the border where there were refugees and whatever little, thing they had set up for people to vote. And the refugee camp was being mobbed by thousands of people, so the New York Times had to say that people were pushing and shoving to be able to come and vote. So maybe, just as Johnny was saying, they're a little afraid now because if you get out there and start talking to people, these narratives, as we've seen ourselves in many different countries, start to fall apart.
Exactly.
Well, let's turn to South Africa, and we are very happy to be joined here by Thapelo Mohapi, who is the General Secretary of the Shack Dwellers Movement in South Africa. Thapelo, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and a privilege as well.
Well, it's really an honor for us, and Abahali, known to many as the Shack Dwellers Movement in South Africa, well known to us here at Breakthrough News. But before we get into some of the other points we want to touch on, maybe for those who have never heard, just explain a little bit who you all are in Abahali, what your movement is, and what you fight for.
Thank you very much once again. We were formed in 2005 as the shack dwellers movement. Shacks are actually shanty towns. They are houses built out of wood, out of desperation. And when we were formed, it was 10 years after the fake democracy or the fake freedom that came to South Africa. We were formed to fight for, advance, and promote the interest of the poor and marginalized in South Africa. We are living in a very unhuman conditions. We live where there is no water and sanitation, any form of sanitation, no electricity whatsoever. We literally live like pigs in muds. Our lives are vandalized on a daily basis. We face brutal evictions. These evictions are at gunpoint at times. Ever since we were formed in 2005, we've lost 24 activists and leaders who are fighting for land, decent housing, and the dignity. So the dignity of a black person in South Africa, when you are poor, it's not recognized. It is something that we've never thought that 28 years later, post-apartheid, we will still be fighting against our own black government that we voted for, that we wanted to change our lives. So there is no better life for us, and we continue to live in the manner that we're living. So the movement was formed to struggle for a just and equal society where human dignity and respect is given regardless of your socio-economic status. So we are against any form of xenophobia. We are against any form of discrimination. We are against we are against racism. We believe that a human being is a human being whenever and wherever they find themselves. So that's basically, in short, our movement, what it stands for. But it's unfortunate that we are being killed for this. As I speak to you right now, I'm in hiding. The president of the movement is in hiding. The deputy president of the movement is in hiding. We are fearing for our lives, running away for our lives. There's a hit list, and I must say that the people who are after us are members of the ANC, high-profile ANC politicians who are out there because they see us as disturbance in using land for profits, and we are saying that land should be used for social purposes rather than for commercial purposes, because we believe that everyone must have access. It's shameful.
Oh, we might have lost Tapello.
Yeah.
We'll try to get him back. There's, for people who don't know,
I hope we can.
I
hope we go because
the power in South Africa. A similar issue, neoliberal governance is leaving people really in the dark. We'll try to get him back there. Abhali Base Majondlo, the shack dwellers movement. Well, while we wait here to get him back, just to circle back around, Rania, to our previous story, and sort of the issue of journalism. We were talking in Donetsk and, of course, about Syria as well that's stuck in there, and I know you've reported from there. We were both together in Ethiopia. Well, we got Tapello back.
Okay. There we go. Hey.
Okay, great. We've got you back, Tapello. Sorry about that. Rania, go ahead. Take it away.
Well, no, I mean, you were talking about, you were breaking down who's after you. There's people in the government, and that your organization has been under attack. There's been a wave of killings. Please continue.
Yes, this year alone, we have lost 4 activists killed in one of our commune, where people are actually planting food, where people are actually having their chicken, poultry and farm, where people are trying to create communes so that they could actually live and sustain themselves. Leaders who were leading that were killed by people who wanted to see the land being used for building properties so that they could sell them. So there was a consultation between those who want to use land for profit and ourselves who want to use land for the benefit of the entire community. So in the commune in March on the 8th, Ayanda Ngila, deputy chairperson of the branch, was gunned down in broad daylight in front of the community, in front of the kids, by hired hitmen who were hired by the ANC-led government. And on the 5th of May, Nokuthula Mabaso, who was the leader of the communal kitchen in in that particular area, which ensured that women and children are able to not go to sleep without food. Was shot 5 times. The killers actually were targeting her in such a way that they actually shot her from the back and turned over and shot her in the breast 2 times to ensure that she was left dead. And on the 20th of August this year as well, we lost Lindokuhle Mnguni, who was the chairperson of the branch, shot 13 times. His partner, fortunately by God's grace, survived at ICU after shot 3 times in the stomach. So these are things that have been happening for quite some time. And of course, Siyabonga Mangwele, in one of the nearby informal settlements, was also shot by police and police came. So these are some of the things that are happening in South Africa, in post-apartheid South Africa. And these are things that we are faced with on a daily basis in our work. And it's difficult. It's taking a lot of strain from our families. It's difficult for us to be living under these, let alone living under these inhuman conditions where we don't have access to basic services. And yet when we are fighting or voicing ourselves to say that we want these things, we are against any form of corruption, that's when we are targeted by the ANC. I'm saying this, the ANC, because in 2016, 2 high-profile politicians of the ANC were arrested and serving life as imprisonment as we speak for having killed one of our chairperson in a branch, in our branch of Abahlali. And those were ward councillors, after shooting her 7 times, hiring a hitman, they were brought into book, and that's the only crime out of the 24 activists that have been killed that we have had justice. Despite that, we have grown, we have built this movement. We are now organizing in 5 of the 9 provinces in South Africa. We have 115,000 membership, because we're a membership-based movement. We continue to be radical. We continue to fight for our rights. We are encouraged by people who are on the ground saying that despite what is happening, we still support the leadership of Abahlali. We are able to organize under very difficult situations. It is a pity that in post-apartheid South Africa, that human rights defenders, those who defend human rights in this country, are targeted in the manner that I am targeted. So anytime, I always say that I'm the only. I'm one of the remaining and lucky leaders of Abahlali. Our names have always been on the list of the hitmen, and these assassinations are carried out by high-profile politicians.
You know, one of the things that I think is very interesting about the work that you all do, and I'm curious how you feel it fits into everything you do, is political education. I mean, I know at the Kana Commune you had I think it's the France Fanon School, and put a lot of emphasis on the ideas and the battle of ideas. Talk about why that's so important for your movement and in the work that you do.
Yes, we believe that it is only when people are conscientized and organized from below that we can achieve what we want to achieve, because we want to achieve a just and equal society. We want to see people being able to have communes. And I think the idea of the Frantz Fanon, Frantz Fanon is one of the great scholars that spoke about grassroots movements organizing from below. And we are very happy that the comrades in Ekenana named the school. In fact, it was named by the late chairperson of the Ekenana commune, Lindokuhle Mnguni, before he left. If you go there, you will see a huge writing that says, Steve Biko lives. So this is a part of the Pan-Africanist agenda, but also a socialist, type of living, that we must all either be working together to actually build a society where no child does not go to school. So the school is actually uplifting young children who don't know about what is happening in the country, because there are people who are called born free, but they are suffering. You say that people who were born post 1994, those are born free, but they came in this world suffering because of the corruption that is taking place in government. So we are encouraged by the school that is there, that exists. We're encouraged by the activists that are there, in the midst of having lost 3 activists in that commune alone, that they still resist. We've recently won the Human Rights Defender of the Year for Southern Africa, particularly recognizing the work that is done in Ekenana. So Ekenana is one of the examples of what a socialist democracy is. Whatever proceed that comes out of the communal garden is shared equally in a meeting in a community hall. Whatever comes out of the chicken, poultry, or farm is shared in the community. They even have a communal kitchen that serves as something that caters for all people in the community, because they believe in the spirit of eating together and working together as comrades. But that's when the ANC, who were in exile, are supposed to be supporting it and encouraging it. Instead, the ANC sees this as a threat, because any organizing outside of the party, we are regarded as a terrorist. Must be someone who is, because black people can't like this. What do people know about their dignity? So I'm saying to you that the ANC-led government has studied the apartheid-led government back then very well. What they are doing is worse than what the apartheid government was doing to MK soldiers who went to exile, and every black person that was treated. So we are treated by our own black people in the manner that is unhuman, like we have now.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us, and I know there's a lot of challenges happening there in South Africa, and it's later in the night. So thank you so much for joining us and giving us a sense into the struggle of Abahali here on the Freedom Side.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate for letting me to have voice heard. We would want, because some of the media in South Africa does not cover these stories, that we are in hiding. It's a normal. It can be normal that in post-democracy we must live in post-apartheid we must live like we are living right now. But thank you very much for giving this opportunity. We hope that this story will go and get to the media in South Africa, because we are being ignored. We feel like we are a forgotten generation. We live like pigs in the mud in the informal settlements, and nobody cares about us. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And you can always count on us, certainly here at Breakthrough News, to cover this struggle. And really, Rania, I have to say, some of the most, in a way, inspirational struggles that I know around the world of what the Shack Dwellers movement are doing, and the fact they've been able to grow and to continue to push forward. But very difficult, challenging situation, and a very unfortunate, very, very unfortunate reality that we've seen from the South African government on this. They have a whole police unit called the Anti-Land Invasion Unit, the Red Ants, that just come and, demolish anyone who tries to use empty land even, to give themselves some shelter in some community. It really is just a shame.
Jeez. Yeah. Horrible. Well,
horrible. We're going to turn to a country that's very close to South Africa, not geographically, but certainly heart to heart, and that's the country of Cuba. A lot of history there between the liberation movements and those two countries. We are very happy, honored, you might say, to be joined by our own colleague, Mr. Kay Pritzker, journalist with Breakthrough News, who is recently back from Cuba, where he was there during election season for the local election structures. Kay, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Happy to be back.
We're always happy to have you. I think you saw one of the things that most people in America think doesn't exist, and that is elections in Cuba. Of course, we're told there is no democracy. So that even in itself is big. But, just give us what were these elections for that you were looking at, and maybe just talk a little bit about, the process.
Yeah, so these were elections for the municipal assembly, and the municipal assembly is the most local level of government in the Cuban system. So there were elections, about 11,000 different constituencies were electing representatives to the assembly, and they had over 20,000 candidates running. So it was, a pretty big election. And they're running to basically represent their neighborhoods in the municipal assembly and sort of solve and manage local problems. So, it's akin to, I guess you could say, like a city council or a town hall. It's not an exact comparison, but it's the most local level of government. A lot of the people voting, know the candidates. Like, it really is hyper local. So you have neighbors voting for their neighbors to represent their neighborhoods in government. Just some quick facts. There were about, of the 11,000 candidates running, about 50% were reelected. So that also means about 50% were newly elected candidates. So, these are competitive elections. It's not like the incumbent just gets reelected. Like in this country, these were sort of competitive battles, and you have a new sort of generation of leadership taking charge in Cuba. Around 70% of the candidates were members of the Communist Party or the Young Communist League, but that also means 30% weren't. And, I think this is a big misconception. Another misconception people in the US have about the Cuban system is that you need to be part of the Communist Party to be in government. That's not true. You can just be a concerned citizen, and if people sort of recognize your contributions to the local community, you will be elected. And this was it's a local election. Voter turnout was actually relatively low this year. It was 68%. They've had election turnout as high as 90% or 95% in municipal elections. But, you take that into account, you compare it to a country like the United States. The turnout in the 2020 presidential election was 66%. Cuba actually has, very, very high voter turnout in all elections. They have a very vigorous sort of culture around voting. So, there's variance here and there, but it really was impressive to see how energized people were for these elections. I mean, people were like texting each other in the morning, "Did you vote? Did you vote?" We had a guide who was sort of showing us around, and she actually wasn't able to vote because she was so busy sort of like showing us around. And she was, she was almost like panicking. She's like, "Oh my God, I didn't vote." But, people take this very seriously. And these elections were very successful, I'd say.
I'm curious, you've obviously, I don't know if you've ever observed an election in the US, but I imagine you voted in the US
Yes.
before. And obviously this is not like, you can necessarily put two things that are exactly the same side by side. But having said that, what was going into this and being able to observe these elections on a local level in Cuba, aside from just the turnout, like what are kind of the more specifics? How would you compare? Like in the US, we do have a lot of dysfunction. Sometimes we don't learn who won for weeks. Not everybody gets to vote because they don't have the day off. The polls close. There's intentionally fewer polls in certain neighborhoods so that not as many people can vote. There's also, like in some parts of the country, actual like vigilante groups that hang out to intimidate voters. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So, coming from the US, just the country you're coming from, what was some of your thoughts sort of comparing to how it is back home versus here?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of differences, and you're right. I really wanted to avoid going in and sort of just doing the imposing all of the U.S. sort of like understandings of elections. I mean, but it really is almost like foreign to see the way people treat elections. The rules around elections in Cuba are completely different from the U.S. I think on one hand, like obviously people take voting very seriously. They understand that this is the way this is a way they voice their, concerns, their issues in government. And they, of course, very much trust the electoral system in Cuba. So, you have this very, you have a high participation rate. Also, like you mentioned, they vote on Sunday. They don't vote on Tuesday. So there are differences like that. But I also think, there's there's also a difference in the fact that in the US, like, you have this massive mythology around voting and elections, like, decision 2020, like, this is your one chance to change everything. You have, one shot, and if you mess it up, you're stuck with this government for 4 years. But in Cuba, it feels a little different. Like, it's not like every election is life or death, because in Cuba, you have to understand the system really relies on the participation of people in politics and in government on a day-to-day basis. The Cuban system really relies on mobilizing all sectors of society to basically, to build the society. So, in the US, like, if you don't win an election, you have politicians who are like, oh, like, well, I'm not going to contribute. I'm not going to help build society. I'm not going to help, make this country a better country and advance our national goals because I didn't win the election. But in Cuba, I mean, you have student groups, you have women's groups, you have, unions who are mobilized every day to basically further the national goals of the country. So in a way, like, everyone really participates in government in that sense. And if Cuba didn't have the support or the participation of those sectors, these people in government just, making decisions really would have no sort of, they would have no one to mobilize. So, there's definitely a sense that it's not like, the elections don't make or break the political system. Voting is just one political act of many political acts. But then another thing I would add to kind of build off of that is, this is really kind of institutionalized in Cuba by the fact that campaigning is not allowed. It's not a part of the electoral system. In fact, in the Constitution, it says you're not allowed to campaign for yourself. In the US, obviously, when a candidate is running, I was actually talking to some of the voters and I was telling them, in the US, you can more or less predict who's going to win an election by who spends the most money. And this just did not register with people because they don't have political campaigns. You can't buy TV ads, you can't buy radio ads, which are, essentially ways to, propagandize people into thinking that you're going to do something in office. But in Cuba, there is no campaigning. So the only thing people have to vote off of is what these candidates have done in the community, especially in these local elections. You're voting for someone who you've worked alongside for maybe years. So you know what their contribution is, you know what their work ethic is, and that's really all you have to go off of in the election. The closest thing to campaigning they have in Cuba is a one-page sheet that they hang up outside of the polling station, and you can read it. It doesn't say anything about, oh, well, I promised to do this. I worked on this project. I spent 50 hours, in the fields doing this and the other. All it says is, this is my name, this is my age, this is where I work, and that's basically it. So, in Cuba, people are really the political system is basically, you're forced to basically put the work forward. People aren't elected based on how much they can exaggerate or sort of, brag about their achievements on TV.
Yeah, well, I'd say that's very, very different. That's like a night and day sort of reality. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting context. And I mean, I'll just raise this. I mean, obviously, this is sort of the elections, but you were just there. And I think it always deserves mentioning when we hear it. Obviously, U.S. policies impact everything that happens in Cuba, the blockade against Cuba. When you were there, what did you see in that regard?
As far as the blockade, I mean, the blockade impacts every aspect of life. But as far as the elections go, I think the biggest blockade is really the media blockade of Cuba. You don't hear anything about the Cuban electoral system. You don't, in the media, when you listen to, whatever, if you watch TV, if you, read a textbook in a U.S. classroom, it says, well, Cuba is a dictatorship because they have a one-party system. In Cuba, there's no democracy, there's no political rights. And, this is really the number one argument I think people make is like, oh, well, how could Cuba be a democracy because they don't have multiple parties? But I really need people in the US especially to ask themselves, take a look at our multi-party system, which is really a two-party system, and ask yourself, is this really the most democratic arrangement we could come up with? I mean, you think about the last 2 years of the Biden administration. you've had a situation where one party has controlled not just the presidency in the executive branch, but both chambers of the Congress. And, they were elected to government to basically carry out a mandate. They were elected to carry out a set of policies. Take Build Back Better, for example, which was supposed to be a $6.5 trillion social spending bill. It was going to be the greatest increase of the social safety net since the New Deal. And, Biden was elected to carry this out. This was his signature legislation. What has happened to that legislation since? I mean, he's had a clear legislative path to do it. He's had the majority in both houses. He could abolish the filibuster and pass this tomorrow, but instead, one senator, a single person who happens to be the biggest recipient of fossil fuel contributions in Congress, blocked this bill, which was voted for by tens of millions of people. It has policies that are supported by over 100 million people, yet this one man was able to block this entire legislation. Is that democratic? Is that a democratic system where one person can override this policy that's popular with the vast majority of the country? In Cuba, they have one party, but the way this shapes their elections is that you don't have, the election isn't about, slinging mud at your opponents. It's not about emptying your coffers to see how many lies and how many slanders you can come up with about your opponent. The government gets a mandate, and the voters say, hey, we want to expand public transportation. We need more access to buses, and that becomes the government mandate. But in the United States, if a party says, hey, we need to expand public transportation, we need more buses, the other party then drains its coffers, spends every single penny it has to attack expanded public transportation. Maybe they're not even against, expanded public transportation, but they don't want that party to have a legislative victory for, the upcoming election. So they attack the policy to make sure it doesn't succeed. So they look like a sort of useless party that hasn't done anything. I mean, you just had a bill pass in Congress today, encoding same-sex marriage, making it sort of the law of the land. And, this is a policy that's popular with the vast majority of Americans. It's something that no one, the vast majority of people support, yet it basically narrowly passed Congress. I mean, it was more or less along party lines with, a few Republicans who switched sides. But if you listen to what some of the Republicans said about the bill, they said, well, it's not that we're even against gay marriage. It's that we think that the Democrats are using this as a way to get a legislative victory for the midterm elections. And it's like, this is a democratic system. This is, stifling social progress so that you can win the next election, stifling social progress so you can make the opposing party look inept or look incapable. This is, a democratic system that represents the will of the people. So, I think, sorry to be long-winded, but I think this complete distortion, this idea that we're sold in the US that, a two-party system, a multi-party system is, that is the definition of democracy, that no other system could possibly represent the will of the people. I think that is an aspect of the blockade, part of the intellectual blockade, part of the information blockade that really prevents people in the United States from seeing Cuba for what it really is. But, luckily it's actually, it's perfectly legal, despite what people say. It is perfectly legal to travel to Cuba. And I encourage everyone who's watching this to, go for themselves and see Cuba for what it really is, and talk to Cubans who actually support their government and ask them about what they think about their democracy, and also ask them about what they think about our orientation towards democracy. Ask them about the things Ronnie was talking about. Ask them about all these different provisions, all these different laws being passed to strip people of voting rights, and see how they feel about it.
Well, I hope that they do and that they let us know what people say, but certainly, Kate Pritzker, your reports, and Rania as well, live there from on the ground in Cuba over the past year, I think have revealed quite a bit about that. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. Well, Rania, let's keep the movement moving on here. Obviously, the story that I think really captivated America over the Thanksgiving holiday season was the railroad workers trying to just get some basic respect and rights for themselves, and having the political system step in the way of that. And we are very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Reese Murtagh, who is a roadway mechanic and a member of Machinists Local 696, with us from Richmond, Virginia. Reese, thanks so much for being with us.
Glad to be here. How y'all doing?
You know, we're doing well. We can't complain. Just pushing forward, as they say. You know, one of the things I wanted to start with asking you here, Reese, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people, there's the politics of it, which became a big issue, and sick days, of course, which a lot of people heard about. But I know it goes a lot deeper than that in terms of what you all are really faced with in terms of the job. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more, you know, even just beyond the sick days issue, not that it's not important, but of what railroad workers really have to face day in and day out.
So around 2017, we saw something called precision scheduled railroading show up. And this is just a cute little name for when a hedge fund takes over and how they basically decimated the railroads and turned us into a skeleton crew. So we have lost about half our membership in District Lodge 19. We primarily work on locomotives and heavy equipment. CSX was ground zero for the PSR railroading model. Hunter Harrison showed up and just tore it to pieces. So what's going on now is the members that have stuck around, the brave souls that are still with us, they are now having to work forced overtime. So, and it's just an insult because, you know, these members that work in our locomotive shops saw all their union brothers get run off by a hedge fund. Now they're forced to work, you know, they come in for an 8-hour shift and, you know, they got 4 extra hours to work, and they're told sometimes when they're in the parking lot, you know, trying to go home. And if they don't stay and work, it counts against them. And they had these ridiculous attendance policies where they start accruing attendance points. And now you have a disciplinary action because you're just trying to work an 8-hour shift. So there are some issues on the railroads in North America.
And of course, what we saw in Congress was them push through this bill that didn't include paid sick leave. And, you know, the media is reporting this is going to cause another exodus. I mean, you're already saying that you've lost all these railroad workers. This is going to cause another exodus of workers. Can you talk a little bit about, because I don't think people understand like how much is transported across the United States using railroads. It's not just, it's not just people trying to get on the Amtrak to go from DC to New York or Philadelphia or whatever. It's also food and fuel. Can you talk a little bit about how important the railroads are across America in terms of actually making the country function?
Yeah, so I traveled from Southern Florida to the Canadian border from 2018 to 2021. I was a system production traveling mechanic. So I saw big plants where they would fill train cars full of natural gas. You know, we haul chlorine for, municipal water supplies. I mean, you name it, it is on the rails.
And in sorry, go ahead.
Eugene. No, go ahead, go, please.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of what was being asked for, there was obviously a strike was being threatened. In terms of what was being asked for, what is it that was being asked for? Because it wasn't much.
Are you talking about the sick days here?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just kind of break down how we got here, because there's a little bit of confusion. So anyway, back in July, we had the PEB board, which is what Biden appointed. And that's where basically the union and the carriers kind of come in and argue, right? So the union went in asking for 15 sick days. They met, they argued. The tentative agreement came out. It included 0 sick days. So then we saw 9 unions hold on to, basically go out to the last minute, right? They ran the clock down. we saw Marty Walsh and Biden, try to make the miracle deal they made. And the miracle deal that Biden and Walsh made included 3 unpaid sick days, but only on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, and he had to schedule them 30 days in advance. So that was the improved tentative agreement, and that's actually what got forced on all Class 1 North American railroad workers. So then all kinds of kicking the can down the road, let's cool off for 30 days. Let's cool off for 45 more days, right? I mean, so much shenanigans and cooling off, right? Then we got to the statement from Biden. I believe it was November 28th. He says, I am calling on Congress to pass legislation immediately to adopt the tentative agreement between railroad workers and operators without any modifications or delay to avert a potentially crippling national rail shutdown. So that is where Biden forced a contract on about 50,000 workers who voted against it. Now, important to note there's no sick days in what he forced on us, right? I read that verbatim for what he put out in a press release. So where did these sick days come from? It came from Congressman Jamal Bowman, did some last minute shuffling and put out a second bill. It wasn't, and that's important to note, right? So they didn't put them on one bill because that would have some teeth. They put 2 out there. And I'm not the most political person, but depending on who you ask, this was more of a symbolic gesture. And obviously it did not pass the Senate. Republicans voted against it. And, the press release that came across the national media was Republicans shot down the sick days, right? Which is true, but misleading. Yes, they shot it down and they're evil people for doing this. But Biden could have said, hey, force this contract and give these hardworking railroad workers sick days, right? So that is kind of how we got here.
I mean, honestly, just stunning on so many levels. And I guess one element of it too, listening to you, Reese, that feels like an important element of this is the forcing of the contract. I mean, I was lucky enough to be raised with 2 parents who at different times have been union members. And, I was raised under the belief that if you're a worker on the job, that you have the right to go on strike to protect your rights. If you have to, you don't want to, but you have that right. I mean, how does it feel to basically be told by the government of the United States that regardless of your own life, your family and everything, you just have to accept it? You can't strike.
Well, there's a whole lot of wrong happened there. First of all, it sets a dangerous precedent, obviously, for us, right? I mean, basically, it's essentially taking a baseball bat and then smashing our kneecaps in. Like, we're going to be limping around for years after this nonsense. But also, this is the president of the United States who is a pro-labor president, right? And, to see him do this, other corporations are watching, right? There's other, big unions who also, if they strike, it's going to cause some disruption to the economy, right? So everyone's watching this. So it set a dangerous precedent. It really did. And the reason, I also need to point out, the reason Biden is getting so much hate and there's all these really hilarious memes going around, and, and in my opinion, he deserves it because he's parading around as this pro worker, savior to the working class. And then, like, when you just go ahead and you gut him, it doesn't look good.
I mean, there's also the squad members, right? Like, the squad is supposed to be extra progressive, not your typical Democrats. And I believe many of them, if I'm not mistaken, at least 3 of them, one of whom you mentioned, Jamal Bowman, actually voted to push this through. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Like I said, I felt like this thing was basically like a freight train that running down a mountain with no brakes. It was, and this is my opinion, this thing was going to pass. I felt like the sick days, like I say, I think Congressman Bowman, and I know, some squad backed him up on that. I felt like it was a symbolic gesture. And, what it did achieve is it started a conversation. So, obviously, railroad workers who carried the railroads, through an entire pandemic on their backs deserve more than a token gesture of a sick day. Don't get me wrong. Like, we're used to getting our kneecaps bashed in. So, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, I guess, because we're used to having no one look out for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that is notable here is that railroad workers themselves have, like yourself, like you here, Reese, been out more in the media, talking more and helping inform people. And I know, you and others, in your lodge are looking to make some changes and to get the voice of railroad workers back out there. I know you're part of a slate that's running for office. Talk about that if you could, who you guys have brought together and what you're looking to do if you're able to, get into office there in the union.
So basically, when this whole thing unfolded was kind of just a slow motion, derailment, right? And, the question is, it should be asked by all railroad workers collectively, where do we go from here, right? I mean, the carriers, it's an all-out war against us. This pro-labor government isn't looking out for us. Our own unions, especially District Lodge 19, sold out their memberships. We actually voted to strike, and they broke our strike, but that's a different conversation. So basically, where do we go from here, right? So, I talked to a lot of our members, and we decided to say, hey, you know what? If our union won't fight for us, we will become the leaders in our union and take it back. And next time, this is going to be different. Our nomination vote is February 3rd. I have a team of 12 really pissed off diesel mechanics, and we're out for blood. We're taking it back. We're tired of our unions having no teeth. Next time we're not blinking. All right. If Congress forces a contract, I'd rather go down fighting than begging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't agree with that more, and I think it's exciting. We'll definitely check back in with you to see, how it all goes and keep covering this story and not let it just be a one and done kind of thing. Reese, I know you got a lot going on, man, and we really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the Freedom Side.
Had fun, guys. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you. Richmond, Virginia. Just also want to shout that out. I don't, listen, we're both. Well, I'm from Virginia. You have some.
I
Virginia
knew
ties,
you were gonna
but,
go there. I knew you were gonna go there. Just to let everybody know, I was born and raised also in Virginia, just like Eugene was.
Mm-hmm,
Okay, so it was Eugene Palin. Apparently, he thinks there's like a real Virginia, and then the rest of Virginia.
It's not.
Real
I think that it's
America.
everyone who isn't from Fairfax County or near environs.
Wow.
But shout out to anyone watching Breakthrough News in Nova. You're exempt from my general feelings about Nova.
What? What does that mean? I'm one of the hosts.
What can I say? You got more to do, but very cool. I mean, Virginia, tough state for unions too. So really cool to hear from Reese, and that's Local 696, Lodge 19 there of the Machinists Union. February 3rd, as you remember, the day of their election, be an interesting one to watch. One thing that's important to note that people should know here, a lot of the strongest unions in America only became strong historically and contemporarily because they went on strike, quote unquote, illegally. The one that's maybe most known to a lot of us, postal workers. Letter carriers had no union. They went on strike, Wildcat Strike 1970, tried to break it with the National Guard. They failed, and now it's one of the strongest unions in America. Shout out to all my NALC folks. But yes, thank you so much to Reese and all the railroad workers, I think, for really just waking up the country again about workers' rights in a lot of ways. So, Rhonda, you requested that we discuss the World Cup. I was shocked. I don't know you as a sports fan, but I was excited in a way because, you know,
So-
hey, there we were. But I didn't know exactly what you wanted to highlight, but I wanted to give you the space to help the world know. I don't know if you want to explain how offsides works, if you want to take
finally
issue
understand.
with VAR, please take it away.
I finally understand offsides, but I don't want to talk about it. It's been a rough couple of weeks trying to
Just the
understand. It's just the line, yes. But they take it a bit far. They're like, hold on, we have to go look at the image 5 times. And they're like, the knee was like a centimeter over where it needed to be. Oh God, why would you do this to me? I am not trying to be a sports pundit. What I wanted to discuss, I'm not here to talk about strategy, okay? I'm here to talk about the geopolitics of the World Cup, which is quite interesting this time around. I am a World Cup fan. I'm not a huge football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, fan any time of the year, or any other time of the 4 years,
Thanks for being
except
honest.
for when there's the World Cup. And I really enjoy it because I think it's cool to watch teams play against each other. I do appreciate when like a country from the global south has a team that goes against like its former colonizer kind of situation.
Yeah.
Or just generally speaking, like gets to win against a European country. It's always fun to watch. It was definitely pleasant to see Morocco beat Spain. But I think this World Cup's been interesting because of what took place around the issue of Iran, I think this World Cup is also unique in the sense that it's taking place in Qatar. It's taking place in a part of the Middle East. And so the fans are quite different in the stands. You have a lot of African and Arab and Asian fans, which isn't always the case depending on where the World Cup is taking place. It's usually like pretty heavily dominated by the main teams we're used to. And also, Eugene, what I found so entertaining about this World Cup is the support for Palestine that's been totally like on display. More importantly, the sort of, how shall I say, not the most warm welcome for Israeli media. That's how I'll put it.
I think we have a video actually
yeah,
to speak to this.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. First question. Is it coming home? It's coming home. More party. Free Palestine. Okay, let's go.
Ecuador, Viceroy. This? Yes. For Israel. What you? No. Yeah. No, thank you. Why? I'm sorry. Arabic.
Which channel is this?
Israel channel. You don't like us? Sorry for my Mafi Arabia. Just 2 things to say.
أعتذر عن
It's coming home.
إجادة اللغة العربية. أقول أن كرة القدم ستعود إلى وطنها وإلى موطنها. وثانيا فلسطين حرة.
So I mean, look, the Israeli, I think after all the normalization deals with, obviously Qatar hasn't necessarily entered into one, but they might as well. And they do, I think, plan to at some point. After the normalization deals with certain Gulf states, and also, of course, Qatar allowing direct flights from Tel Aviv to Doha, there was, I think, an actual belief among Israelis that they'd finally be able to go to like an Arab country, the way they actually have been going to Dubai and other parts of the Emirates. Quite openly these days. And they would be like welcomed with open arms. And it's just been interesting to see. It's not just like there were some videos of Lebanese people refusing to talk to Israeli media, which is to be expected because obviously they're just still enemy states. But there's been Saudis refusing to talk to Israeli media and saying we're with Palestine. And the Qataris, I mean, you saw that video of the Qataris refusing to talk to Israeli media. And this is just a couple among many, many, many videos showing this kind of attitude. And it really does speak to the absolute failure, I think, at this point at least, of these so-called normalization deals backed by the United States in actually integrating Israel into the region. Like, I think this shows you that just because a few Gulf monarchies normalize with Israel does not mean that their populations agree.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very, very good point. It's been interesting. That British guy I love. And it's, it's one of the things actually that I think is great about the World Cup is how fan cultures kind of bleed into one another. And it had been right before that final English gentleman, or that day, basically, and the day before, there had been a lot of fans from Arab countries who were, bringing in these chants about Free Palestine. And obviously, they're meeting these people from other places. They're coming together. They're mingling together. They're having a great time. And now all these English fans, it's coming home. That means the championship is a big thing for England. So obviously, bringing that into their lexicon. I have to say the Saudi fan culture a little more lit than I thought. They have kind of lit up a lot of the arenas there. Senegal, also amazing fan culture there that has blown it up. And I love the World Cup. As you know, I'm a big sports guy, but I think the fans and seeing people come together across culturally is always one of the coolest parts of it. I definitely agree with you. The people beating their former colonizers, that maybe, I don't know, when I look at the French team, which is a team I followed for many years.
It's made up of the colonized.
It really is.
Like
I saw someone in Côte d'Ivoire say for the French team, last African team left in the tournament. But big game, France, England coming up soon. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in many topics to say, and I'm sure we'll be able to follow it. I'm just glad you know what Offsides is. I appreciate that you've gotten it together. We'll be looking for all your sports commentary moving forward. Next week, Ranya's going to actually break down the college football playoffs. It's going to be pretty big.
Eugene's lying, but you know what? Tune in anyway.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I think you should become a bookie. I actually think at the end of every show, you should give the line on whatever the next weekend's games are, NBA,
Here's what you should
whatever.
put your money on. Yeah. Here's what you could put. Yeah, I'm just going to end up being hunted down by people who lost all their money because I have no idea what
definitely.
I'm talking about.
The people on WinBet will come for you. Just want to quickly shout out for folks. We had a couple donations, an anonymous one, Rich 4, Mr. 13FNG, always with us every week. Really appreciate you as always. Thanks to everybody who donated. Yes. See, look at that. That brings us to the close of the show as always. And as Rania mentioned at the top of the show, you can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news if you want to become an ongoing patron, which we would deeply appreciate. And of course, subscribe and hit the bell so you get the alerts. And for myself, for Rania, we will see you next week.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe. We did it. We did it, Joe.
We'll do it live. We'll do it live. We'll do it live.
We did it. We did it, Joe.